Hi, I'm Scott Humphrey, CEO of the World Floor Covering Association, and this is Leadership Live. This week on Leadership by the Letter is our second week on the letter L, and one of my favorite words. In fact, I would ask you to put an asterisk next to this. Remember this word, because this is the word that should really drive all of us as leaders to live the way that we live. This week's word is the word legacy. Let me give you a couple of definitions. Legacy means making an impact that will last long after you die. That's kind of a dictionary definition. My definition is this: that which extends the impact of one's life is their legacy. I don't know about you, but I'm at that age where I want to do something that outlives me, that outlasts me, that has an impact on generations far beyond me. And in order to do that, I need to start now. It was Stephen Covey in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that said we are to begin with the end in mind. I used to do an exercise in a program we called SALT back at Shaw, the Shaw Academy for Leadership Training, where I would have people write their own eulogy. It can be a daunting and intimidating task to write down what you want people to say about you when you're gone. So why do you do that? Because if people will picture what they want people to say when they are no longer here and look at where they are now, the distance between those two is what they live for every day. In fact, we call that the dash. I recently read a story about a father who took his graduating high school son out to the cemetery. They liked history, so it wasn't anything unique to them to go around a cemetery and just look at it. But the father took his son out there and he said, "Son, I want you to spend 30 minutes walking around. And at the end of that, I just want us to sit down and talk about what you noticed." And so that's exactly what they did. They met back on a bench and he said, "So son, what stood out to you?" He said, "Well, I noticed some people were buried by themselves, but there were also some husbands and wives that were buried together, even though they didn't die at the same time." And he said, I wondered how lonely it must have been to stay around when the one you loved has died." He said, "That's great, son. What else did you notice?" He said, "Well, I noticed that some people were dead back in the 1800s, a long time ago, and I thought about how different life would have been back then." He said, "Okay, son, did you notice anything common among all the headstones?" He said, "I don't know what you're getting at, Dad." And his dad said, "All of the headstones, as long as the person has already passed, have a start date and an end date. And in between is this thing called the dash." He said, "Okay, I'm listening." He said, "Son, you can't control when you start. And for most of us, we can't control when that date ends. But what we can control is the dash in the middle." And he said, "That's the reason we should live." He said, "Son, what will your dash look like?" Now think about that. Take yourself out of Leadership Live for just a moment. Think about your own life and ask yourself that question. What will your dash look like? I've known some people that lived a very long time, but they had a very small dash. That means they lived for themselves, but they didn't leave much behind. They didn't have much impact through the life that they lived. Listen, you have the privilege and the ability to live your dash now. Think about what it is you want to accomplish, what you want people to say when you are no longer here. And look at where you are now and determine what are the steps to get me from where I am to where I want to be when I'm no longer here. I recently reread this book, The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. He was a professor at Carnegie Mellon, and he found out he had 3 to 6 months to live. And so he decided to do something unique. It's not totally unique. Other people, as they've retired, have also given a last lecture. What made Randy's unique was he wasn't retiring. He was leaving this world. And so he decided to share his wisdom, his knowledge, and his insights from his life. He decided to share his dash with all those people that he'd had a privilege of meeting, whose lives had impacted him. Over 400 people showed up live, and others were watching simulcast as he shared insights, very basic insights. I want you to, if you will, to take a chance to read this book. Maybe read it again, which is what I did, because it's amazing how enlightening it is to get on the last days of somebody's life and find out what was really, truly important to them. Randy Pausch accomplished more in his life He was a visual technologist. He was one of those people who understood technology. And a lot of what we see in the movies today is because of what Randy Pausch did. But he accomplished more in the last days of his life because he wrote down and presented a lecture called The Last Lecture. Listen to me. You have the privilege of living your last lecture every day. We have no guarantee there is a tomorrow, but you can control what you do with today. The reality is, you can control your dash. What's your legacy going to be? Is it simply that you had the title of a leader? Or is that because you were a leader, you positively impacted the lives of people during your time, but long after you were gone? That's what leadership's really about. That's the kind of leaders I hope I'm talking to on this podcast. I want to challenge you. Live your legacy now. Live your dash. And go out there and lead.